So today's topic is a little bit more complicated than usual. I usually have just one, at the most two articles or resources that I want to talk about, but today there's more than that. It begins with an article by David Scott, who is one of the academics left in the United Methodist Church that I actually think is more thoughtful than most. I mean, he and I would still disagree on a number of things, but I find his tenor, he's the opposite of hysterical, and he seeks to be fair, and I appreciate that about him. So this was posted on, these articles today I found on Chris Ritter's peopleneedjesus.net, a great resource for everybody trying to understand all things Methodist, and it's just a great sampling of these different phenomena that all of our local churches are dealing with. So I'm not going to read this whole article. I'm going to connect it with some other articles, and then you'll see why. So let's just begin it together, and then I'll skip through. Inspired by the upcoming work on the General Book of Discipline for the United Methodist Church, this quadrennium of the UMC, I have been examining over the last couple of weeks how the United Methodists understand the concept of discipline and what it means to have a book of discipline. As part of that series, I asserted that the purpose of having a denominational book of discipline is to help United Methodists live productive lives of Christian discipleship, where together with others in Christian community they grow in holiness, i.e., love of God and neighbor. No disagreement from me. I also asserted that one of Methodism's theological insights is that actions matter in the Christian life, and that discipline builds on this insight by trying to regulate Methodist actions to encourage those actions which best express holiness and discourage actions which are at odds with holy living. Last week, I looked at the rules and norms as two different ways to influence action. This week, I'd like to suggest another pair of approaches to influencing action: boundaries and ideals. So boundaries are things that hem you in. Ideals are things that you're reaching towards. In brief, boundaries set limits of acceptable actions. They determine what sorts of actions are prohibited or out of bounds within a particular community, and what actions are required of a community's members to remain in the bounds of the community. Boundaries set expectations for behavior by indicating what behaviors people should not engage in and focusing on penalties for not performing required behaviors. So this is, of course, what made the United Methodist Church untenable. It had a book of discipline established with boundaries that were no longer enforced or defended or protected, and the covenant body fell apart. Ideals, on the other hand, he says, set standards and goals for desired and discouraged actions. They determine what sorts of actions would best reflect the beliefs, values, and identity of a community, and what actions would be inconsistent with those beliefs, values, and identity. Thus, they set the aspirations for behavior by indicating what behaviors people would exhibit in the best of situations, even if there is recognition that in practice, individuals will not exhibit all of these behaviors or will not exhibit them perfectly. And then he goes through a list of different particulars. And then at the end, he comes back to the African Methodist Episcopal Church. He says, I recommend reading through their book of discipline. So much of the UMC's section of ordination is focused on boundary setting, required mentoring, required education, required papers, required committee and board meetings, etc. The AME Book of Discipline has some of that, to be sure, but the AME Book of Discipline also has beautiful passages describing the qualities that a Christian minister should embody. It describes what sort of a person ministers should be, or at least should aspire to. It lays out the ideal. And so I don't disagree hardly with anything that he says here. He and I would disagree on what boundaries should have been set for the United Methodist Church and how they correspond with the Bible. We would not be of one mind on that. He's under the impression that a new book of discipline globally is going to be established, that they do maintain the covenant. And I think that that is a flawed presupposition, because we've already seen that people in leadership in the United Methodist Church, if they're not covenant breakers themselves, they're not of such a disposition that they're willing to punish covenant breakers, at least if they're punishing it on the left. So what we've saw at the last General Conference was removing a lot of those boundaries for moral behavior, especially as it pertains to human sexuality and sexual morality. Anything that's remaining so far as ethical behavior, moral behavior, biblical behavior, it remains to be seen, and I don't see why they would think that the United Methodist Church would defend boundaries established, or the particular direction I wanted to go, have any sort of helpful specific ideals for what a disciple looks like or what an ideal pastor looks like. So what he focused on at the end here was there needs to be something we're aspiring to. The AME tradition is great at painting a picture, and I haven't read the AME stuff, to be clear. I've read a lot of early Methodist stuff, which was much more aspirational and was as clear on the positive and on the negative. The frustration I had with the United Methodist Church for a long time while I was in it before I left was they had this language, the mission statement is to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. And it's a great mission statement, but there was no clarity about what a disciple is. And so it was just nice, empty words or virtue signaling. But a disciple meant different things to different people because they were following different Jesuses, because they're following different religions that use the same words. And if that confuses you, just watch a lot more of my stuff. I've laid that groundwork. The reason this matters. Here's another article. A steady stream of new churches. The Reconciling Ministries Network put out an article showing a picture of a love train, which immediately, harkens back to the General Conference where they did the conga through the plenary floor after having victory over the wicked conservatives. The article really doesn't say anything. It says more churches are joining up, and isn't that great? It doesn't have any numbers that I could find as to how many churches are actually joining, but I thought maybe just covering this one and going, as conservatives leave, the rest of the denomination shifts left. But I'm not sure how many denominations actually are joining up. This is really just kind of a puff piece telling churches how to join. Maybe one or two have joined, maybe 100 have joined. I really have no idea. But my concern in covering this was to make a projection. And my projection would be the same as what Lonnie Brooks projected in this piece, Centrist Progressive Coalition Could Soon Unravel. He published this in 2023, long before the split happened. Anyone who doesn't know who Lonnie Brooks is, he's a great thinker. But what he says in this fine article is that now that the conservatives are going to be kicked out, they are going to, far left liberals and progressives are going to turn on centrists and defeat them. Because here's a key thing I wanted to focus on. Progressivism is not defined by an ideal thing that they're aiming at together. It's defined by an enemy that they're fighting against together. So that was the conservatives, which in the United Methodist Church, conservatives were still pretty liberal by a lot of worldly standards, or not worldly, but the standards of other denominations. They looked at conservatives in the UMC and said they're still obviously liberals. But even so, they chased all them out. So rather than, I should have called up the article. They did try and start their own denomination. The progressives did. It was called the United Methodist Connection. No, Liberation Methodist Connection, LMX. And it fell apart early on because they could not agree on the aspirational ideals that they're aiming at together. This is how far left progressivism works. It's not defined in what they're for. It's defined in what it's against. And so it's against anything that resembles the past, dead white men, ideas that they espoused, any ways that expressed in modern politics, trying to hold any of the social fabric together. What unites them is a shared hatred and opposition to people like me and what we stand for. So that's why people like me have largely separated from them, and now we're trying to protect what we build together, because what they do is they infiltrate so that they can destroy, So David Scott and others like him are being optimistic that now that people like me left, they can create an organization, something that has not just boundaries, he should talk more about that, but also ideals. And I would actually say that the United Methodist Church is almost destined to fall apart because there are all these different places where they're going to have division. So it was real easy whenever you had these bigots that just said marriage can only be between one man and one woman, this caricature that they love to have. And it's true, but in that way. But there's also like a lot of variation in what is acceptable. Is it acceptable, for instance, for polyamorous people to be in the church? People who are either married and sleeping with people outside of their marriage, that would be adultery, or just adults that are living together and having sex, especially when there's kids in the mix. Is that acceptable within churches? You're already finding many in churches dividing over that. This trans thing, there might be people saying, okay, gay people, they can have a marriage among themselves, but what do you do with trans people in the church who expect for the church to participate in their self-image? I was corresponding yesterday. I get stuff like this all the time. People send me stuff, wacky stuff that happened in their United Methodist Church. It is not just one or two places. This is pervasive. It's endemic, and you'll see different versions of this. So I'm not going to give any details about who he is, because people like this write me and they say, I still live in this community. I know these people. I don't know if I'm comfortable, just outing folks like this. So I'm not going to give any details that could identify this person or where they are, I don't think. But this is real. I really found we add two major dramas at my, I think he said had, I think he was dictating. We had two major dramas at my old United Methodist Church. I didn't know I was so principled, but man, did I get hated on. When we got a new minister, he turned out to be a big liberal. So when he came, he was right of center, but then his daughter came out as a lesbian, and then another child of his turned into a trans person, said they were the opposite sex. So luckily, I was able to just go down to the road and join the GMC. There was so much craziness going on in that United Methodist Church, lying from the pulpit that the board didn't have a problem with it. Apparently, they did have a problem with these things. Then the trans kid wanted to turn into a boy. The pastor was letting that boy use the men's restroom. And so this is, a lot of people would say, what business is it of yours? What's it have to do with you? Well, when you're in the local church and you're sharing in the fellowship with these people, they bring their theology and their ideas, and then there is no way to be unaffected by them. They enter into the most vulnerable places, and they put you in a position to see what you'll do. There's a United Methodist clergy who's a gay man who married another man who was in his early 20s when he married him. This clergy I'm talking about is in his 60s. That makes a lot of people pretty uncomfortable. When a man in his 60s marries a woman in her 20s, that raises some eyebrows. People in those kind of situations won't find many churches where they can be comfortable. There are a number of things like this where the United Methodist Church seems to have cast a vision of no boundaries, ultimate liberation, but there is no way to do that. That is ultimately demoralizing, and you cannot have a community without boundaries. So yes, have ideals, but if the ideal is just this undefined freedom, then different people are going to agree on what is helpful, what is holy. And what you're going to find is churches continue to fall apart because there's nothing binding them together. They are going to disagree over this stuff. Some churches will just go to hell in a handbasket and, hey, whatever you want to do, just show up and give some money and do whatever you want. I got this new book, Shepherds for Sale. It's written by Meg Basham, and I've been following the developments on X, Twitter. She writes, the whole thing, you see the picture of these a pastor preaching, and you see the strings of him being a puppet. She goes through a number of issues showing that large church leadership, both denominational and non-denominational, has been compromised for some time by large moneyed corporate and federal interests, and she substantiates it quite well. I've seen that there's been some drama just on the first chapter. She quoted Gavin Ortland, and he did a piece saying she misquoted me. She took it out of context. I was making the opposite case a lot of the time. she was able to show already one clip where he clearly was saying what she said he said, and then she's promised to follow it up with more receipts. So that remains to be seen. It could be that she's been disingenuous in her interpretive lens. She's said a number of things about Ken Collins, Tim Keller, Russell Moore, trusted leadership that turns out being compromised. And that, you have to be wary about this. There is a conspiratorial mindset that there's just no good actors and everybody's been bought. And you don't want to give in to that kind of paranoia and cynicism. So I'm gonna read the book. It came in yesterday. I want to see what she says, but I've read her stuff, especially on Ken Collins. Is it Ken Collins? No, it's the one who was the former chief of NIAID. Francis Collins. That is his name. Francis Collins was a bad dude. He lied about being a man of faith, or he might have some kind of faith, but it's not the Christian faith. It's not a biblical faith. And she substantiated that quite well in two different pieces that I've read from her. Anyway, why do I bring that up? Well, she substantiates where a lot of this money comes from and what it did. This is on page 202 of the book, and this has to do with the United Methodist Church. In 2000, a man named John Stryker, he's the gay heir to a $100 billion surgical supply conglomerate. He kicked off the new millennium by launching the Arcus Foundation, a grant-making institution that soon became the largest funder of LGBTQ initiatives in the United States. But after legislative defeats like the passage of a 2008 California law banning gay marriage, it realized its efforts to break down America's last remaining vestiges of traditional sexual morality were continually running into the same formidable roadblock, Christianity. As the journal Inside Philanthropy put it in 2013, in recent years, quote, it has become clear in the U.S. at least that the only real opposition to LGBT equality is moral opposition based on religious beliefs. It seems Arcus is committed to combating this argument at its very source, end quote. The source, of course, was churches. Stryker's foundation, Arcus, began devoting tens of millions of dollars to, in its words, quote, challenging the promotion of narrow or hateful interpretations of religious doctrine, end quote, within every major Christian denomination. Between 2013 and 2018, for instance, it gave over $2 million to the Reconciling Ministries Network to, quote, secure the full participation of people of all sexual orientations and gender identities in the United Methodist Church, end quote, the last of the mainline denominations still resistant to full affirmation of the entire rainbow panoply. How did RMN go about this? Reconciling Ministries, that was the group I was talking about with the love train at the top of the article. They said a lot more United Methodist churches are becoming Reconciling Ministries churches. How did they go about this? According to Arcus's own reports, by, quote, training faithful Methodists at all levels to become advocates for the LGBTQ person in the full life of the church, end quote. Given that the United Methodist Church went through a schism in 2022 over LGBTQ ordination and gay marriage, it seems Stryker's money was well spent. So I've reached out to Meg Basham a couple of times for an interview, and I'm not usually that persistent. She's just an amazing culture warrior and a person of faith, and she's a great journalist. She's fearless. But she hasn't answered me. I think she's only talking with people of a certain theological profile, and Methodists, even ones that left for the GMC, are suspect. So I don't know for sure that's why she hasn't answered me, but I hope she will answer me because I think she has a great voice, and I'm very interested in her insights as to what has happened, what is continuing to happen. So anyway, you might consider reading the book. I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. But just keep in mind, as I continue to report on things, there is a deep skepticism on my end about the quality of pastors that are leading American flocks now. And this is something that I've spoken with Dr. David Watson about. I understand that, well, heck, even the most liberal pastors are still ministering to people in their homes and in their hospitals and going into jails. They're doing work that I would identify as hard. But the particular task of shepherds, pastors is to guard the sheep from the wolves. And wolves can be people, but a lot of times they're ideas, theology. And American clergy have shown themselves particularly not up to the task of defending flocks against ideas of death and destruction. So we're seeing that death and destruction in the United Methodist Church. We're going to continue to see it because they have let the wolves in the church, and wolves can be people, but they can also be ideas. And just as a reminder, we are told in the scriptures, our enemies are not flesh and blood, but the rulers, powers, and principalities. We're going to see that in the United Methodist Church. And then the question is, within the Global Methodist Church, within other bodies that are hoping to be biblical entities, are they going to be able to hold their pastors and leadership to a high standard? Are they going to have a clear idea of what an ideal leader or disciple looks like that they're all aspiring toward? Are they going to guard the boundaries of their covenant? That all remains to be seen. There are not many bodies that have been up to the task. I recently reported on the Church of the Nazarene defending their boundaries after letting wolves in for some time. But just because they defend the boundaries once doesn't mean it's all over. There's a continual dripping, pushing from forces that want to dismantle the church, and there are big moneyed interests aimed at incentivizing that leadership that will legitimate such a betrayal of our heritage. So beware, watch your own pastor, pray for your pastor, keep them faithful, watch denominational leadership. That's why I started this whole channel, is to keep an eye on what people in authority are doing and saying, making sure that they are honoring the covenant that we've established together. That is needed in every single body that is given and entrusted with dollars and a heritage. That's already happened in the Global Methodist Church, that it's been entrusted with much, and to whom much is entrusted, much is expected. And so be in prayer for, if you're not Global Methodist, whatever covenant body you belong to, whether it be big or small, because there are worldly forces seeking to undo it. And if you do not defend the gates, you will get overrun.